American System to Associate Professor at the University of Brunel, which is in West London. He is currently in the first of 2 years holding the Major General Matthew C. Horner Chair in Military Theory at the United States Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. I think I first met Matthew at a pub in London during the London heat wave, an un-air-conditioned pub in a really, really awful heat wave in London. And Matthew and I have since been to a couple of conferences sort of all over the world, actually, and I have Matthew to thank for one thing that I'll just throw out before I introduce him, is thanks to Matthew and a long night in a bar in Tel Aviv that I learned that if you are hungover in Israel, the Dead Sea is a phenomenal cure for hangover, and I learned that thanks to Matthew. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Matthew.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, I would like to say it's a great honour to be here, and I'd like to thank Mike Nyberg and Andy Wiest for inviting me. I knew of the programme here, the Military Studies programme, for many years, and as you all know, the programme is well regarded in America, but over the pond in Britain for many years. When I was a Ph.D. student, I knew of the connection here because of the exchange that you had with Sandhurst. So it's a great honour for me to be giving the talk here today, and you'll be delighted, I hope, to know that there's no PowerPoint involved. I hate PowerPoint, and it's not in many ways a complete waste of time. I'm just going to talk, and I'll talk for between 40 and 44 minutes. I'll probably talk slightly less because when I start talking in a public arena, I tend to talk slightly more quickly, so I'll give you an opportunity for Q&A afterwards. And something on the structure of the talk. I'll do an initial blurb on the Arab Revolt, just to let you know what it was, very quickly. I then want to make a point on empirical data, the brutality that the British conducted in Palestine. So I want to just make a little passing comment on that. What I want to spend the bulk of the lecture doing is looking at the literature and the theory surrounding British counterinsurgency, and I want to draw some ideas about the British legal system in place at the time. And for those of you who want the argument of the lecture now, so that you know what I'll be arguing, I basically argue that the British adjusted the legal system. They changed the law to make brutal acts legal. So basically what they did was they made things that intuitively seem unlawful, lawful. And that's really the thrust of my paper. If I have time, as I'm judging it as I go through the paper, I will make a brief comment about regimental difference, because what you discover is that some British troops tended to be more brutal than others, and the argument is that a particular group of British troops, i.e. Scottish troops, were the most brutal when they suppressed the Arab Revolt in Palestine. That's not my argument, that's the argument of the Palestinians, because that's the complaint that they make. So, the Arab Revolt starts in 1936, it's in Palestine, part of the British Empire. Actually, technically it's not part of the British Empire, it's a mandate from the League of Nations, but it's run as part of the British Empire. It starts in April 1936, and it starts with the murder of 2 or 3 Jews travelling in a convoy of taxis on a road between Tulkarm and Nablus. They are attacked by a group of Arab assailants, or bandits, or terrorists. 3 Jews are murdered. This happens on the 15th of April 1936. The attack was launched by an Islamic patriot, the Sheikh Izz al-Din al-Qassam, and those of you who've been following the trouble in Gaza recently, they are called the Al-Qassam Rockets. There's an Al-Qassam Brigade, because the Palestinians celebrate this guy as a famous Palestinian patriot. The attack was unremarkable. This was a country in which there was chronic hostility between the Palestinians and Jewish immigrants. There was a subsequent funeral for one of the murdered Jews in Tel Aviv. There was rioting at the funeral. Subsequently, 2 Arabs sleeping in a roadside hut were murdered in a revenge attack. My point is that by the 18th of April 1936, the British colony of Palestine was in a national situation of a national revolt. There was a national uprising and strike. This was by the Palestinians. They were protesting at Jewish immigration and settlement to Palestine, so the roadside murder was simply the spark that set off this nationwide revolt. Now, the revolt endures for 3 years, from April 1936 to late 1939, but it's in 2 phases, because the first phase of the revolt is from April to October 1936. There's then a ceasefire, during which a commission is sent out to Palestine, headed by Lord Peel. Peel comes to a conclusion in 1937 to partition Palestine. The Arabs, the Palestinians, reject this, and from September 1937 until 1939, there's a second phase of the revolt. It's a very serious revolt. The British lose control of Palestine, and they even lose control of the old city of Jerusalem for about 5 days in October 1938. If any of you go to Jerusalem, it's the wall section that in 1938 made up the major part of the city, because you didn't have the sprawl either in the western section or to a lesser extent in the eastern section, the eastern part of Jerusalem. Now, the rebels, the Arab rebels, directed their violence at Jewish settlers, but they also directed their violence at the British, and they targeted British soldiers, British police, British colonial officials, and also Palestinians who were working for the British authorities. Now, it's the British response that is the focus of my paper, because what the British do in response is to launch an intense and prolonged imperial policing operation. This is what we would know today as a counterinsurgency. Now, this phrase, counterinsurgency, does not become fashionable until after 1945. So I'm imposing a term that we use today on something that happened at the time, which was referred to in a different way. Indeed, if you look at the British literature, the first use of counterinsurgency by a British author in a British book comes in 1967. So I'm hoping that in the paper that follows, you'll allow me some leeway. I'll sometimes talk about imperial policing, sometimes counterinsurgency, sometimes counter-rebel operations. The British response was huge. Compared to what the Americans are doing in Iraq, it doesn't seem that big, but you need to put it in the context of the time. The British deploy about 25,000 men, and I think it is nearly always men, no women, the equivalent of about 2 infantry divisions. 25,000 men in a territory the size of Palestine is a massive swamping of the country by British troops. Right, so there you have it, that's the Arab Revolt. I now have a problem, because I've been working on this for about 3 years, and I've built up a mass of empirical data. That's what you're supposed to do as an historian. Of course, if you're doing political science, it's not like that. But for historians, you're building up a mass of empirical data, and I have lots and lots of information on brutality, on torture, however you describe it, define it, abuse, vandalism, destruction, extrajudicial killings, all committed by British soldiers and British police. Now, I've only got 40 minutes, and I could talk for hours about what the British did, and all that you'll have at the end of the paper is a mass of information which you'll walk away with saying the British did a lot of bad things. I'd like to give you something that's more conceptual, that you could use, for instance, to apply to the American operation in Iraq or Afghanistan today, or what the Soviets did in Afghanistan. So I'm asking you to take on trust that the British did commit a lot of brutality in Palestine when they suppressed the revolt by the Palestinians. There's a paper appearing next month in English Historical Review, and if you're interested, it has all the empirical data, most of it. It's quite a long article, so you can see what's what there, but I'm not... the British do some pretty awful things. So, if you can take that empirical data set as given, what can I say theoretically about it? Well, what I want to do in the paper is to pivot a discussion on the British repression of the revolt by relating the brutality of the British to 2 things. One is the literature on the subject, the books that have been written, and secondly is the legal use of force by British troops, sort of the theory of how the British repress insurgencies. And of course, the British do this quite often. The British Empire was built on, whether it's India or Ireland, repressing the local people. So, for the purposes of this paper, what I mean by theory is the general method of understanding and doing something, a systematic statement of rules and principles. I don't mean it in a more complex theoretical way associated with, say, the Frankfurt School or critical theory. It's a fairly sort of basic approach. But by tying practice to theory, my examination today will highlight the relationship between the conceptual underpinnings and the practice of British imperial policing. Now, if I have time, I'll make some passing comment on regimental differences, but I'll have to see how things go, because my understanding is it's a very strict finish time of 7:30. So, the abuses that I'm asking you to take on trust. Well, let me start with the literature, because the abuses that the British commit in Palestine challenge a theory that you will find in the literature that the British used, and this is the phrase, minimum force when they suppressed colonial revolts. It's an issue that's raised to an extent in the literature on counterinsurgency, and something that differentiated the British from other colonial and neo-colonial powers. One key country which Britain is compared to is America. The argument being the British use minimum force, the Americans use excessive force. More than that, the literature on counterinsurgency is rather curious. If any of you have read any of the literature, much of it's politically mobilised, and it reads like an instruction manual, often written by soldiers or colonial officials, showing how you can defeat an insurgency. Or, if you're interested in looking at it from a left-wing perspective, it's on how to succeed in an insurgency. But in all of the literature, the issue of human rights abuses and non-combatants' human rights is largely ignored. Now, the defence of the British, and this applies to Palestine, is that where there were abuses against civilians, these were exceptional aberrations, rather than examples of a systematic or systemic abuse. And if any of you are interested in a good author on this, you should have a look at Thomas McCarthy, who's an American academic. And I have a quote here from McCarthy's Ph.D. thesis from 1988, which was published as a book. It's a key text in 1990, and it's called British Counterinsurgency. And I'll just read these short quotes out. Quote, "Relatively few cases of documented abuse by the British occurred, and these were usually the work of local forces lacking the traditional discipline of the army. Even if allowance is made for the possibility that excesses might have occurred, the sparsity of reported cases over a 20-year period suggests that on the whole the British behaved with commendable restraint. The British generally did not tolerate anyone taking the law into their own hands. Isolated incidents of ill treatment no doubt occurred, but these were never the result of official policy. Allegations of misconduct were usually investigated and abuses stopped," unquote. Now, in the counterinsurgency literature, there is almost no interest in human rights per se. It's only interest in the respect for civilians' dignity where it helped or hindered military operations, and so they might require a friendly or local or minimally hostile populace. Human rights are a peripheral indirect problem to the key driver of the military operation to defeat insurgents. Now, as I stated above in reference to the use of minimum force, where the literature on counterinsurgency and Britain's part in it touches upon the role of non-combatant civilians or captured soldiers, what it emphasises, and you'll hear this phrase over and over again in Iraq, is the hearts and minds aspect of British counterinsurgency. The British were exceptional, and the British Armed Forces, quote, this is from Ian Beckett, generally more scrupulous than most, unquote, worked within the rule of law, and the British avoided human rights abuses that marked out other colonial powers. This is a quote from Frank Kitson, a British soldier. "No country which relies on the law of the land to regulate the lives of its citizens can afford to see that law flouted by its own government, even in an insurgency situation. In other words, everything done by a government and its agents in combating insurgency must be legal." This has expressed the ideal of the British way in counterinsurgency. Now, for me, having looked at all these cases of abuse, of torture, some pretty horrific things that the British did to the Palestinians, the British tried to do some of these things to the Zionists in the 1940s. It didn't work so well. It's some pretty appalling things. I felt that there was an incredible disjuncture between the theory of what the British were doing and the practice of what British soldiers, boots on the ground, were actually doing to Palestinian insurgents. There's a book by Caroline Elkins that some of you might have come across on Britain's suppression of a revolt in Kenya called Mau Mau in the 1950s, and she wrote, ironically, because she's very critical of the British, "Decades have been spent constructing Britain's imperial image, and that image contrasted sharply with the brutal behaviour of other European empires in Africa. King Leopold's bloody rule in the Congo, the German-directed genocide of the Herero in southwest Africa, and France's disgrace in Algeria. The British reputedly avoided all of these excesses because simply it was British to do so," unquote. It's also the view of the British in Palestine at the time. One senior commander remarked to a colleague, quote, "If the Germans were in occupation of Haifa," which is a town in North Palestine, "we'd not have had any bloody trouble from the Arabs," unquote. Now, there has emerged in recent years a more critical literature on the British role or British way in counterinsurgency, and I locate my paper and my publications on this within this more critical literature. And a good example is Simeon Schul, who died recently, a young man who just very unexpectedly died, before he could get his Ph.D. published into a book. So this quote is from his Ph.D., but it would have been published, and it will be, if it is ever published posthumously, a good book. Schul argues in his Ph.D. against McCarthy is very pro-British, that there has been to date a general reliance that the British employed minimal force. Where this is gainsaid and brutality alleged, there are only partial attempts to quantify the force employed. that there's been a persistent failure to dig into the experiences of many people on the ground and accompanying over-reliance on official sources, unquote. Schul is right. I completely agree with him. The methodological challenge, if you're looking for abuses against civilians, is finding the evidence of excesses from soldiers and colonial officials who don't leave behind records of abuses. This is the problem. It's an opaque war. And what happens is people say that the British are not brutal. The reason is it's very hard to find the evidence of what happens. And you have an intuitive sense, but you really have to bore down. It's got hardcore historical methodology of looking in the archives and looking at different archives. Oral history is very good for this. This is what I've found in discovering cases of abuse. You don't want to remember the bad stuff. That's a quote from an American veteran from the Second World War, so it tends to get hidden away or forgotten. But it's also worth looking at the people that the British target. The main target in the repression of the Palestinian revolt are poor, illiterate Palestinian peasants whose suffering simply go unreported. In fact, if you look for the reports of the suffering, most of it doesn't come from the Palestinians. There are some accounts in Arabic, and there's a whole set of printed volumes with letters which do have information in Arabic. Most of the information comes from Christian missionaries, Anglicans, Episcopalians here, Anglican mission in Palestine, which reports the abuse. So they're reporting the abuse that the British commit against Palestinians. The Palestinians themselves have great trouble articulating their voice, making their voice heard in terms of what goes on. It's an opaque war, as I said, and it's worth bearing in mind when you consider the argument that the British forces behave properly. Of course, the response from McCarthy et al. Will be, well, if you don't have the evidence, then you don't have an argument. You can't just say intuitively it seems the British do something. But my point to you earlier was you need to take on trust, so I have to do it, I haven't got enough time, that there are, if you look through the records in enough depth and enough detail, many accounts of some pretty appalling behaviour by British servicemen, especially the Palestinian police, and not the Palestinian, the British Palestine police, and also the prison service. And reading accounts of what happened in the prisons of Palestine was like reading an account of something like Abu Ghraib or worse. Really some pretty horrific tortures, although I think some of it might have been exaggerated, but some of it wasn't. So, how can I present you with a sort of conceptual underpinning? Well, I can't measure whether abuse was systematic, because what I have are sort of ad hoc examples across from different bits of the campaign of abuse. What I can measure, to some extent, is whether abuse was systemic. And the way I do this, or I'm suggesting to you the way I can do it, I have done it, is to use the legal system. So what I've done is I've looked at British military law, which is what I'll spend the rest of this paper talking about, to see whether the British had a theoretical basis, or more precisely, codification and authorisation for a certain level of abuse in practice. And when you look at the British legal system, very quickly you see that there is here a system, an official system, which permits abuse. Let me start with the legal system. Let me move on to the legal system. Soldiers in Palestine in the 1930s conducted themselves as an aid to the civil power. Now, to do that, they needed rules, and they have two sets of rules. One is the King's Regulations, which now will be the Queen's Regulations. But if you read the King's Regulations, there's only a small section in it on duties in the aids of civil power, and it largely relates to the United Kingdom, and it's a long list of what you do if a soldier has been had up for desertion or something like this. There's not very much on treatment of civilians. Where you find the rules for the treatment of civilians is in a manual of military law which was published in 1929, but it was a publication that had been, not annually, periodically reprinted over a period from the late 19th century. So what this was the law as it was evolving and the law that the British Army had to follow. Now it's a bulky hardback volume, you can get a copy in the Library of Congress, and because it's so bulky, they produced, the British, two abridged paperback versions that officers, the men wouldn't take these things out, but the officers would, and you could fit in your army pocket when you go out on operations. And they were published in 1934 and 1937. The titles were, for the abridged ones, were Notes on Imperial Policing and Duties in the Aids of Civil Power. Well, let me just look at the 1929 manual is the Bible, and the other two abridged versions flow from it. So let me look at the 1929 manual, which really is the set text. Now, if you look at the manual, at first sight, it seems to be a very proper document, because what it states is that a soldier should always conduct himself properly, should never steal and maltreat civilians. And what it states is that a British soldier is always also a citizen, or a subject technically, but is also a citizen. And he is subject to civil as well as military law. And quote, "An act which constitutes an offence if committed by a civilian, such as torturing someone, which would be illegal, is nonetheless an offence if committed by a soldier." So, at first sight, it seems to be a very proper document. But if you dig deeper into the 1929 manual, it's 400 or 500 pages of legalese. It also provides a legal framework for a whole series of brutal acts. It allows for shooting rioters, and it allows for, quote, "collective punishments," unquote, and, quote, "retribution," unquote. And neither of these terms are properly defined, obviously on purpose, in the 1929 volume, and both of them underpin, to my mind, what the British do in Palestine, and in Ireland, and in India, and in Egypt, and in Burma, all across the empire when it comes to repressing colonial revolts. The policy is not new. In the 19th century, there was a book by a chap called C.E. Caldwell, and it explicitly justified, he didn't bother making any bones about it, reprisals and punishment actions against civilians. He thought this was perfectly normal, and the book that he published in 1896, Small Wars, was a set text for the British Army. And the practice of British counterinsurgency, if any of you know about Ireland, 1919 to 21, the British would routinely inflict punishments on civilians for what the insurgents had done. There's no definition of what constitutes collective punishment or reprisal in the 1929 volume, if there is, let me know because I couldn't find it, or the subsequent 34 and 37 pamphlets. So what happened in effect was that British field commanders had considerable leeway when it came to interpreting the rules, which of course is why the law is drawn up precisely in that way. The law for soldiers was clear, you can read this, that they should use collective punishment and retribution as a last resort. They should also avoid needless civilian suffering. They explicitly state that. But the 29 law clearly states that where coercion is required or where terrorism needed to be checked, collective punishments and reprisals, which, quote, "will inflict suffering upon innocent individuals, were indispensable as a last resource," unquote. This is the text, people. As the law stated, quote, "the existence of an armed insurrection would justify the use of any degree of force necessary effectually to cope and meet with the insurrection." Now, in principle, people who were victims of any maltreatment could take out a civil proceeding against a serviceman for individual offences. These are theoretically possible, because if a soldier does something that breaks civil law, he has broken that part of the law, and so he could be taken to court. But if you take a strict reading of the military law in place at the time, with its basic general acceptance of group punishment and reprisal action, most excesses that the British commit in Palestine are legally permissible. Now, theft, torture and assault occur. These are unlawful, and the British say they're unlawful under the civil element of the law governing soldiers. But soldiers had almost had little to fear from disciplinary action. This is Schul quoting. Quote, "complaints about military were frequent, lawsuits rarer, and successful lawsuits almost unheard of. In the colonies, the military had a freer hand than in Britain, and restraint of excessive violence was far lighter," unquote. Now, what the Arabs could do is try and take a civil proceedings through the civil courts against an individual British serviceman. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to speak to a lawyer about this, but what happened in Britain was before 1947, the Crown was immune from prosecution. The Crown is the government. So what you'd have to do, an Arab who's been bashed around the head, or the British would use rifle butt, smashed his head in with a rifle butt, this Arab, once he gets out of hospital, would go along and try and take out a civil proceeding. But he can't take the civil proceeding out against the British. He has to take the proceeding out against the individual soldier. This is simply not practicable. Now, one Palestinian claimed that soldier number 65 had beaten him, not realising that every man from that unit, the York and Lancaster Regiment, formerly the 65th Foot, had 65 written on the side of his sun helmet. It's impossible in practice for the Arabs to take out individual claims against British servicemen who can respond by saying that their actions were legally permissible because of the law in place. The British also established military courts and regulations, which meant that which could not be challenged by the civil courts. So what the British did was they stamped a military court system on top of the civil courts. They didn't get rid civil courts, but the military system was paramount, which made it even more difficult for the Arabs to make any complaints. Now, I have found only one, this is in a 3-year conflict, with thousands of people are killed, I've only found one example of a successful prosecution of 4 British Palestine police. Now, these guys blatantly executed a handcuffed Arab in the streets in a place called Manshir, which is between what's now Jaffa and Tel Aviv, or it was Jaffa and Tel Aviv then, on the edge of Jaffa. And the only reason that prosecution happened was that the people who witnessed it were not Arabs, but were non-British Europeans. Italian, it was an Italian and a German witnessed this execution. If an Arab had made the complaint, it never would have led to a successful prosecution. Now, the British were bound not just by their own military law, but also by international conventions, some of which you will have heard of. There's the Geneva and Hague Conventions. And the Geneva Conventions are 1864, 1906, 1925, 1929, all superseded by the key Geneva Conventions, which is 1949. There's also the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. I don't want to get into the details of them, just to make one point. The international laws in place in 1936 dealt nearly in the main with the treatment of captured soldiers and the conduct of war. They don't say anything about the treatment of civilians. Now, the British classified the Arab Revolt in Palestine as an internal insurrection. They didn't classify it as a war. So international law in place at the time was not applicable to the Arabs involved in the Arab Revolt in Palestine. So what the British did was that when they captured Arab guerrillas, or Arab terrorists, whatever you want to call them, they treated them as ordinary civilian criminals. And they modified the law by making it a capital offence to carry a weapon or carry any ammunition. You carried one bullet in your pocket and you were caught with that by the British, you were liable to be hanged. And the British were very careful during the course of the revolt to put captured suspects before the courts, before often quite quickly hanging them. The British also established not full, but almost full, martial law in Palestine at the time, and this further eased civil limits on soldiers' behaviour. The British never instituted full martial law, but they instituted what they called statutory martial law, which was a level between semi-military rule under civil powers and full military authority. And the army, and not the civil government in Palestine, had the upper hand from 1936 to 1939. There was de facto, to my mind, if not de jure, full martial law in Palestine. Now, the British never entirely removed the civil authority from Palestine, from the decision-making process, but the High Commissioner, who's the British political leader in Palestine, the head of the civil authority, really tempered rather than directed the actions of the armed forces. And there are 2 High Commissioners in charge. The first chap is a man called Sir Arthur Wauchope, and he looked for a political solution to the revolt, and he tried to rein the army in. And the army, this antagonised the army, who thought him far too lenient, and they referred to him as Washout, to play on his name, and also Gaga. And in 1938, he was replaced with a more compliant High Commissioner called Sir Harold McMichael. My point to you is that the collective punishment principles which underpinned the brutality in Palestine were, strictly speaking, legal. Indeed, if you look at Israel and look at Israel's dealings with the Palestinians, the Israelis, actually not the South Africans, but the Israelis picked up much of the British repressive system, and they used it, in fact they still use parts of it, against the Palestinians. Now, the torture and extrajudicial killings, the assassinations, which I'm asking you to take on trust, because I haven't got time to go through them all, were illegal. But nobody was prosecuted for them. All the British managed to do was to moderate some of the excessive violence. What the authorities did was they reconstructed the law to give the soldiers' actions legality. The emergency regulations in force during the revolt made, as a pro-Arab British resident of Haifa noted, and this is the title of my paper, quote, lawful things which otherwise would be unlawful. In practice, what the British did, I don't know enough about I don't know enough about what the Americans do, and I'm struck by how the British managed to run their empire so cheaply and effectively. The British mobilised, if you wanted to be harsh about this, they corrupted the legal system, passing very tough laws to make official heavy-handed methods legal. Now, you can go further than this and ask a factitious, an artificial question, or indeed a facetious question. If an act is legal, how can it be wrong? But if you're going into someone's house, as the British do, you burn everything, you burn the house down, you smash everything up, you beat up the men, you take them off to a distant detention camp, you leave the women behind, you probably beat some of them up, there's some issue of sexual violence, but not very much. If these things are basically legal, how can they be wrong? Now, if any of you have read Hannah Arendt's study of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi, The Banality of Evil, the article that will appear in an English Historical Review is titled, not The Banality of Evil, because I don't think the British were like the Nazis, but I've entitled it The Banality of Brutality. Because what ordinary British serviceman, just like if you read Adolf Eichmann, he's so ordinary, that's the point, he was just obeying orders. But it's the same, because British servicemen and officials, once the legal system is in place, can accept the premises of their government that allows for participation in destructive, brutal acts. And they can do it with all the energy of good bureaucrats obeying orders. Now, the British High Command, on a practical level, to my mind, tolerated, or it was unable to moderate, excessive abuse committed by its men in the field. But this raises another subjective question. What's excessive force? What's minimum, what's necessary, what's excessive? The literature says the British are minimum. I can give you examples of the British using excessive force, which strikes me up to a point as being systemic because it's embedded in the law. Now, having said this, senior officers, British officers in Palestine at the time, were sensitive politically, if not morally, to any charges of abuse. So it tends to be junior officers out on operation who are intimately involved in any excesses. The Anglican bishop in Jerusalem, I think, puts it rather succinctly, rather nicely. He wrote, quote, "Outrages are not officially sanctioned, although they have not been officially regretted," unquote. Now, whether there's an unwritten code, this is the problem when you're looking at historical data about these sensitive issues, whether there's an unwritten code from on high sanctioning British soldiers to commit grass-level abuse is unproved, and it's probably impossible to prove because no one's going to leave a written record of such orders. The Anglican bishop felt that those in the highest positions of authorities deplored the deaths of innocent civilians. So there are civil and military breaks on operations that stop it going to too much of an extreme, which is something that doesn't happen with, for instance, the Germans in the Second World War and, say, the Eastern Front. But nevertheless, I think there are similarities there between the two cases. I'll make a brief comment about regimental difference, which will take about 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'll make some concluding points, which means that I'll be within my 44-minute maximum time slot, as I said at the beginning. I'd like to make a point about regimental difference. If you assess any misconduct, did all the British Army act as one? Were they all as bad as each other? Well, the Britain's forces of repression are not united or systematic. The army and the police, the Palestine police, which is made up of British, they have Palestinian police as well and Jewish police, but I'm talking about the British portion of the Palestine police. The army and the police behave differently. Some of the worst abuses I've come across were committed by the police, not the army. And that's actually true in Mau Mau during the 50s in Kenya as well. Actually, the army often behaves more properly. But I'd like to pick up on something that the Arabs pick up on. As if you look at Arab propaganda, they make the claim that what they call Scotch, properly Scottish, regiments committed the worst outrages. And in the Haganah archive in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, I found an Arabic leaflet which had been translated into clumsy English. So the English quote I'm going to give you is the quote as the Arabs have organised it. For distribution to soldiers. Quite interesting. The Arabs, normally they put this up in Arabic, but they've written it in English, and they've obviously done this to hand it out to British servicemen to show them that they know what's going on. This is what the Arabs have to say. It's written in a very particular style of language, which if you look at a lot of Arabic documents, you see more of this. One can never imagine inhuman deeds than bombing up the houses over their inhabitants, it's their clumsy English, not mine, over their inhabitants of innocent ladies and children, of robbing passengers, then shooting them, of ruining whole villages and scattering their inhabitants to die of cold and thirst. The British did do that. They wipe out a village and they just send the people out onto the hillside. And of obliterating the I don't know quite what this means, but and of obliterating the ladies of those killed persons. The British on the whole were quite careful to avoid sexual violence, which is something that has happened in other insurgency campaigns, that they might terrify the peaceful citizens. These savage actions are mostly committed by, and this now is in capital letters, Royal Scotch regiments in so many places of Palestine, and hundreds of photographs are kept for future generations to behold these actions of, and again in uppercase, Royal Scotch regiments, unquote. Now, the Arabs have a point if you triangulate their evidence against evidence from the British side. And there's a Palestinian police officer called Sidney Burr who left a very graphic account of his time. It's in the Imperial War Museum in London. And he said that the Scottish regiments were the worst offenders when it came to causing trouble. And quote, if an Arab sees anybody in a kilt, because the soldiers didn't always wear kilts, but sometimes they'd wear a kilt, they'd run a mile. In the trouble last year, the Scottish soldiers used the bayonet on the slightest excuse. The Arabs are aware of regimental difference. They protest against specific regiments, such as the Black Watch Regiment, which was involved in an outrage at a village called Halhul in 1939. And it's quite interesting when you read the official account, and then, if any of you are history majors, and you bore down and look at the actual history, there's an official account of the searching of a village called Silwan. If you go to Jerusalem, it's now part of the Jerusalem kind of conglomeration just to the south. It's an Arab village, but it still is. And in Silwan, there was an assassination of 2 British soldiers from the Black Watch Regiment, and after it, the tracker dogs were brought up, and these tracker dogs took the British to the village of Silwan, so they know that the suspects, or they think the suspects, are in Silwan. So the official recount, which you can get at the time, is that the authorities sealed the village, they forbid the villagers to leave without a permit, they made all the males of the village report every evening to the police, and the village had to pay for a 20-man police post. And a bit punitive, but maybe these people deserved it, they killed 2 British soldiers, or somebody from the village did. You then hunt in the National Army Museum, and you come across a diary entry from a North Staffordshire regiment, different regiment, an officer who's writing to his own diary. But why is he going to lie to his own diary? Maybe he's got an error, but he's not going to lie to his own personal diary. He details in his diary how the Black Watch beat to death, after that incident, 12 men with rifle butts in the village of Silwan. Now, here's the official account. No injuries. Here's the unofficial account. 12 men dead. Now, I've interviewed some Palestine policemen who are still alive, although they served in the 1940s, and I've also spoken to a lot of people in the British Army, and I know this has been video, so I need to be a little bit careful with tapes, I need to be careful what I say, but I mean, unofficially, if you speak to people in the British Army, and this is why it's hard for me to present it, because it's a conversation I had over a beer in a bar with an ex-sergeant from the Lancaster Regiment, they back up what the Arabs say, that the Scottish regiments were particularly bad. One guy was describing to me how they executed a guy in Aden in the late 1960s, smashed his head to pieces against the front of a lorry. And this, he said, oh, that was Black Watch soldiers doing that. And if you know anything about some of the later excesses during British counterinsurgency campaigns, some of them are Scottish regiments. There's a village called Batang Kali where the Brits kill about 25 villagers in Malaya in 1948. 48, Scots Guards. If any of you know about Mad Mitch in the crater in Aden in 1967, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and also the rape at the Falls Road in Belfast in 1970, which was Black Watch again. Having said that, the single most serious incident during the Troubles in Northern Ireland was the Bloody Sunday shootings of 1972, and that was by the Parachute Regiment, which is a non-territorial, anyone could join the Parachute Regiment, you don't have to be from Scotland or anywhere, it's a non-territorially based regiment. I myself don't feel that the kind of regimental approach is that useful, but they do consistently complain about Irish regiments like the Royal Ulster Rifles and the Scottish regiments, and it might be something that's worth bearing in mind if any of you... I don't know what it's like in the Army. The American Army doesn't have the regimental system, but it does have traditions, I know, from 82nd or 101st, or I mean, at the moment I'm working with the Marines, and the Marines find all of this, it's very un-American and very un-Marine to, say, have an incident like Haditha, which they're very, very interested to uncover why it happened. So there is difference. If you looked at your own army and your own armed forces to see whether there's difference across from different branches in terms of good behaviour or bad behaviour. So let me make some concluding points. It'll take about 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. My argument to you this evening is that British military law, and also the operational method, i.e. what the guys do out in the field, embedded the targeting of civilians in a way that was brutal and could cause atrocities. I don't know what came first, the often brutal operational method, or the laws and collective ideas, traditions and norms, those things that are so hard to measure, that validated the brutal method. And if any of you know anything about the British tradition, this is not surprising, because the British always prefer flexible practice over codified theory, compared to, say, France. The actions of the British in Palestine certainly challenge the idea of British exceptionalism, this sort of hearts and minds approach in countering insurgency, and they provide support for critics of the British colonial policing methods. Now, some of the incidents of brutality, which I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to detail to, you can ask me in the question and answer session, I'm happy to go through them. Some of the incidents meet the dictionary definition of an atrocity, one of the key points is an atrocity is a heinous act which has no moral reference. And mostly when the British do things, there is a moral reference point. And you compare it to what the Germans do in something like counter-partisan operations on the Eastern Front, and you're comparing chalk and cheese. These are really not the same thing. There is moral restraint. Caroline Elkins describes the British in Kenya as operating a gulag state, in reference obviously to the Soviet gulag, and I think that's going too far. The British forces, in theory, employed minimal force. In practice, they behaved brutally, but to my mind, rarely atrociously. Also, and it's an awful point to make, but it's one you have to make, it worked. The whole thing was grossly unfair, but on a practical policy level, the British targeted Palestinian civilians because they wanted to get at the rebels, and they couldn't catch the rebels, so they targeted the civilians. The British repressed the revolt. They repressed the revolt by 1939, which is what the British wanted to do, so they could free up their troops for the coming war in Europe against Germany. And the argument of minimum force, I don't think, works. The British troops used force across a spectrum. It's not so much minimum force as necessary force, and at times excessive force. And excessive force involves torture and execution. But of course, excessive force is often itself necessary to secure Britain's objective of defeating the rebels by targeting, this is what you do in a counterinsurgency, you target the civilian support base, whether it's in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s or Palestine in the 1930s, on which the rebels depend. So the best that I think can be said of the British military response to the Arab Revolt is that in the face of a nationwide colonial revolt, British forces acted with more humanity and restraint when compared not absolute, but when compared to other colonial and neo-colonial powers operating in similar circumstances, which is an achievement, but only an achievement of sorts. That's 44 minutes, thank you.
Palestine, does that represent the worst of British brutality among its colonies?
No, I mean, the famous one is the Amritsar massacre in 1919. To put it bluntly, the British tended to classify different peoples in what today you say were racist terms, but they were applying a term that wasn't being applied at the time. They would define their empire in different categories, and they tended to view the empire as white, brown, or black, and they viewed the portion in Palestine as brown, which was also India, as opposed to Africa, which is their term, not mine, black, as opposed to white, which would be, say, Ireland or back home in the UK, or if they were dealing somewhere where the population was Caucasian. And as a consequence, they tended to moderate their violence on the basis of their cultural assumption. And as a consequence, the Palestinians were seen to be a more civilised people, and therefore the British tended to be more restrained in what they did. So, for instance, they wouldn't bomb Palestinian villages from the air, and they make this a specific point, and they think this would not be a civilised thing to do against a fellow, they use the expression civilised or semi-civilised people. So no, it's not the worst, and the British soldiers at the time, they're often quite positive about the Arabs. There's no personal animosity towards them. What you would call racism does drive, they're called wogs, they're French were wogs, everyone was a wog who wasn't British, and they would use racist terms against the Palestinians, but they used them against the Jews and the Arabs. They didn't have any particular preference, they just thought they were all non-British. And they thought the Arabs were a once great civilization. They were very impressed by serving in the Holy Land. This was a time, well, certainly from Britain, maybe depending on the culture, which was more infused with the Bible, so they had that connection. So that moderated their violence. And if you compare it to Mau Mau and in Kenya in the 1950s, the violence in Palestine, to my mind, is less. But I'm not an expert on Kenya. I've only read some literature on the Kenya stuff. But the Kenya, all the really bad excesses in Kenya, they castrate men, they rape, castration, they kind of skin people alive, all sorts of terrible things. Those things are largely not conducted by the British Army, they're conducted by white settlers in Kenya who join emergency police and army units, and these are the people who are really fueled up with racial hatred. Because, you know, your average British recruit from London who goes over, he's doing 3 years in the army as part of national service, he's probably kind of racist in the sense that he sees these people as black Africans. But it's not the same as a white settler who's got a personal investment in Kenya, and they commit some appalling atrocities against what they call them Mickey. They always have a name for them. In Palestine they call the rebel Uzbeks, which is in Kenya they call them Mickeys. I don't know why, and they commit some appalling atrocities. But it becomes more and more as the 20th century unfolds. I'm a bit of a weak historian. Things get better and better, and on the whole, the British are, as social norms and values change and the British Army changes. So, I mean, they don't do in Northern Ireland in the Troubles what they did in Palestine, or indeed in Ireland in 1919 to 21. I mean, some of you may be very close to what the British did in Northern Ireland, but they were not as violent as they were in 1919. Things change. Unless you're in the German army in the Second World War, in which case nothing changes, you just carry on behaving appallingly, and you don't realise that the world's moved on, but you haven't.
I was wondering about the public relations side of this. I know after the Second Boer War there was a public backlash against what the British Army did. I'm wondering if they wanted to change their laws so they could come back and say, well, hey, we didn't really do anything that bad, everything we did is legal now.
Yeah. Excellent point, good question. The British technically run, it's not part of the British Empire, technically it's run through as a League of Nations mandate, so the British have